Hello, everyone. Welcome to MVP Tech Bytes. Today we have Elham. Elham, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Taswar. Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Elkhan Yusubov, and I'm a Microsoft MVP and Microsoft MCT from 2007. And what I do, I actually work with the team and with our customers to make sure that we can enable their cloud journey. And I'm glad to be here, Taswar. Thank you for your invite.
No problem. So I believe that today we're going to be talking about bicep, like bicep.
Yes, we'll make sure that we can upskill our bicep. That's the
Yes.
main idea here. And of course, if you want to upskill, you need to kind of learn a little bit more about that and maybe dive a little bit deeper. So that is going to be our focus for today. But before jumping into that, this is just a little info about myself and what I do in the community. I'm also
Mhm.
known as Cloud Marathoner in the community. If you are up to to learn the innovation that happen in the cloud, especially in the automation, security, and architecture part. And I'm a core member of Cloud Launch and Learn. Maybe you saw me there, sometimes presenting, sometimes moderating, depending on the day. But I'm really glad to help the community and everyone to upskill learning the cloud. In this case, I'm more excited about Microsoft Azure, but we know there are some other clouds, and they are all in some way related to each other. So learning one and being proficient in one of them will make you, well aware about other cloud types as well. So long story short, in our session, we are going to focus more on Bicep. But before doing that, if I just slide here, I'm also working for a company called T-Rex Solutions. We are
Mhm.
located in the MV area here, DC, Virginia, Maryland. But we are having employees all across the United States. So it's not just, there. We are global in terms of recruiting and having the people. So we have a number of, federal, civilian, Intel community projects that's going on. So if you are looking for a new opportunity and you want to work in a progressive and very competitive company, you are more than welcome to check our openings and shoot me a note if you are interested in any of those positions. Now,
Excellent.
in terms of what we are going to cover today is it's all going to be about bicep, but not. And in order to make sure that you actually get something out of our session, we are going to start from the very basics, fundamentals in the beginning, and then we build up to the level where you want to learn about what are the latest things that are happening in Bicep community and why
Mhm.
it is important because the Bicep language itself, which is you will learn that why we need that is for the enabling your management of cloud resources and being proficient in that. With Bicep language, you can do a lot more with easy syntax. But before jumping into that, let me actually go back and say that we will start from the basics, then we'll build upon more of a real world examples where you need to
Mhm.
harden your code, you need to harden your resources against the security vulnerabilities and validations that you need to have in place. And then if you get enough time, actually we'll build an automated pipeline where we are not going to touch the terminal or anything to deploy our Bicep resources, but it's going to be up to GitHub to pick up our code on any change, validate that, test it, run some smoke tests, and then deploy into our environment. So are you ready
Cool.
for that?
Yeah, excellent. I'm excited.
Let's do that. Yeah,
Yeah.
and this is like on a high level what we are going to cover. I'm not going to, name them one by one. But if you are a VS Code kind of enthusiast and you like the VS Code, you will like this one as well. All right. So let's give like a little bit boring part of the session, which is introductions, what's Azure Bicep and stuff like that.
Mhm.
But we need to know what this for, right? So first of all, it's called DSL, and DSL stands for domain specific language, which means that Azure Bicep is just focused on Azure environment and the resources that you declare there and how you manage them. Um, its primary goal is to give you some ability to easily create and manage those Azure resources. It is actually related to ARM template, which is Azure Resource Manager templates, because it's a I wouldn't say it's a synthetic sugar on top of it, but this
Mhm.
higher level language that's built on top of ARM template, meaning that whatever you can do with classic way of creating and managing, resources in Azure, which was actually the name is ARM templates. You can do
Mhm.
the same thing and even more with Azure Bicep. And
Cool.
it's a new and cool way doing infrastructure as code on Microsoft Azure, in addition to other tools that are already there.
Cool. So I wanted to find out what makes Azure Bicep different from regular programming language like C Sharp or Python or any of these languages.
That's really good question, actually. Uh, the biggest difference is that it's again domain-specific language, meaning that the whole purpose of Azure Bicep is to simplify creation and management of your Azure resources uh, in your Azure, environment. And I'm not just saying Azure subscription, because
Mhm.
using the Azure Bicep, you can also manage your tenant level objects like management
Okay.
groups and stuff like that. So the main idea is that you cannot use Azure Bicep to create this regular app, for example, to go and track your fitness and stuff like that. But you
Mhm.
can use Azure Bicep to create the, create the Azure resources and put the settings and parameters there that the way how you want them to be finally deployed into your Azure environment and run in a way that you define them. So it's a declarative language. So in terms of how Azure Bicep is related as a code to the Azure environment, this is a small infographic about that I borrowed from Learn, Microsoft Learn. And as you see here, we have Azure Bicep. So let me see if I can, yep, get the pen here. So we have Azure Bicep here, right? So this is the file that we are going to create and work on it all day today. And then Azure Bicep file is actually, once it's ready, using some command line tool, and you can also use the portal, we try to deploy that resources into the ARM layer. And in this Azure Resource Manager is not the same as Azure ARM template. As you know, it's a layer that has the validation, compliance, and all the checks against what you are trying to deploy are happen in that layer. So it's kind of like gateway for your environment. So once it passes Azure Resource Manager, it's going to provision those resources that you pushed from Bicep file. So, however, before they get pushed to the your environment and your resource get provisioned, your Bicep code is actually is going to be transpiled into ARM template, because that's the classic way how your Azure ARM layer understand the
Mhm.
resources and their configuration.
Okay. So I mean, there seems to be like a confusion too at the same time, like as in ARM and also
Yes.
ARM Resource Manager, Azure
Mm,
Resource. They all simplify into a ARM sort of thing. So I could
yes.
see that there's a difference between those.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and we'll look at ARM template. It looks differently. It's a JSON
Mhm.
representation of your Azure resources. It looks much different than your Bicep code. While ARM layer itself, Azure Resource Manager, is the gatekeeper for
Mhm.
anything that you want to provision or change in your Azure environment. So it's more of a layer in the Azure that's watching all these HTTPS calls and that come to the layer in order to update, delete, or do any modification to the resources that you have in your
So
subscription.
it's almost like, if I simplify it another way, it's almost like the
Right.
API gateway. Let's say you're building an application, all
Mm-hmm.
your resources come to the API gateway first before you hit the microservices or all
Yeah.
these other services you have. So it seems like Azure Resource Manager is more
Mm-hmm.
like almost like the gateway to get
Yes.
into your resources.
Yes. That's a very good analogy. Yes, it's a gateway to your resources and everything that you have under your Azure subscription and tenant. Yeah. Let's move to the next slide. So here, in terms of Bicep language from the benefits, so there are a lot of benefits to Azure Bicep language. I'm not going to go through all of them, but
Mhm.
the first benefit I will show you in the demo, that it's easy to, you will see that in the demo, is that it is very easy to understand and maintain that code. And it comes with day zero support. So what it means that whenever there's a new feature or update happens on the Azure Resource API, it's going to be available to you right away, meaning you
Mhm.
don't have to wait for any packages updated or anything like that. You can use them right away from your Azure Bicep code. While if you use some third-party tools, let's say Terraform is one of them that you might be familiar with, you would have to
Mhm.
wait for update from the provider in order to be able to access that feature or that update. So that's kind of like
Okay.
first benefit. Then you have, we already say that it's a transparent abstraction over ARM template. Comes with awesome tooling in Visual Studio Code, and you will see that in action. It comes with very clean code syntax. It has code reuse and modularity in place. It has very, I would say, intuitive integration with Azure itself,
Mm,
and it comes with a lot of useful things when you are doing development of your Azure resources. Like you want to have some pre-flight validation, meaning that let's say you already created your Azure resources that you want to deploy to a subscription A, right? And
mm,
then it's very, very possible that if you didn't know what's happening in your subscription A and you just try to get these 5 or 6 resources deployed into the subscription A, it may fail in the mid, right? There might be
mm.
some issues in some resources that you didn't check, you didn't know because you don't know what's the state. So with pre-flight validation, you can prevent that from happening and get this check from the Azure environment by running this pre-flight validation to see what updates are you are actually going to do there, and are your updates and changes on the resources going to be successful or not. So you can
Okay.
have, before deploying your resource, you would have this confidence that okay, is it going to succeed or not,
Okay.
right?
So is it somewhat kind of like almost like a simulation, or is it more like in the Terraform world, it's more like plan sort of thing? Like I mean, you're saying that hey,
Yes.
here's what I modified. Let me know what how the resource is going to change.
Yes, so it's more of the second one that you described. Here are the
Mm.
resources I'm deploying to this, scope, to this, for example, to the subscription scope. Let me know what's going to be changed. Is it going to be
Okay.
deleted, updated, or removed, right?
Okay.
And then you don't have to manage the state with Bicep code like you have to do it with the Terraform. That's another,
Mm.
big change. So no state file there, and it comes with production support. Uh, Meaning that let's say you are using that for your production,
Mm.
and then for some reason you run into some weird problem, right, that you don't know what's going on. You can open official Microsoft support ticket and
Okay.
get your issue resolved. That's how the
Cool.
beauty is. But
Mm.
before speaking too much about that, I think it makes sense to go and look at the demo, right, so that we can see
Sure.
how it is doing. So to do that, I'm going to switch to the Visual Studio Code. And by the way, today in our demonstration, we are going to use a repo called Learn Bicep. This is I'm going to show, provide the link to this repo so that you can go and, check the code and see how you can benefit from that.
Mm.
Okay, so the first one is we are going to look at minimums. So here under the modules folder, just to show you that we have this minimum storage bicep. So this is just a example of how we define a storage, and you would see a lot of things. So for example, there's like built-in validation in Azure Bicep, which I don't want to jump right now, but it's called like linting the Bicep code.
Okay.
So that's the reason why you get this squiggly line here, because the rule says that you should not have any parameter, any unused parameter in your code. That's why I'm
Mm.
getting this line. So just to make sure that our code will compile, I'm going to comment that out for now. uh, so what we have here, right? So we have a parameter. So if you've done a little bit of scripting or coding, it's kind of like intuitive to understand what's going on. So
Mm.
on the first line here, let me actually take this out so we just see the code. We declare the region, meaning the location where we want to deploy our Azure resource. That's going
Okay.
to be defined. And
So
here,
as in
yes,
region, as in like the region that you're deploying, ES,
East
yeah, East
US, West
US,
US,
West.
yes,
Okay.
yeah. And here's the thing: you can also give that right away, right? So one of the options is that you can actually say that okay, the region that I'm deploying is East US. In our case, or let me actually type correctly. Okay, and it will pick up and use it. But this is going to be defined, statically, right?
Mm.
However, if you want to make sure that uh, the resource group, where your Azure resource is going to be deployed, if you want your resource group to pick up the
Mm.
region of the resource group where it belongs, then you can actually use the function called resource group. What it happens is that if you created your resource group, which is basically a folder where you want to have all your resources combined together, And the
Mhm.
reason why you want to have a resource group is because you want to manage the life cycle of all resources together. So it's you have some type of, I would say, governance in terms of do you want to remove them all or update them all. So it's kind of like one of the easy concepts to manage the Azure resources. So
Okay.
in your resource group, you define your Azure region. Then in order to have that dynamically picked up in your code, you can use this function called resource group. So you pick up the location, which can be East US, West US, depending what's your resource group's location is.
Mhm.
And then, of course, you define a resource. So when you define resource, you use the resource keyword here, right? And then we define the name for our resource. In our case, it's not the name that you would see there, but it's a name for the declaration, and we call it
Mhm.
storage account. But and then we have this. This is the first what you see here is going to be the type that defines that from this provider, which is your Microsoft storage provider, you are getting the storage account type. This is the resource,
Mhm.
and then you have the oops, and then you define the API, right? And
Okay.
there are like different APIs, and then you define the name for your storage account. And if you know with the storage account names, it's very picky, right? It needs
Mhm.
to be having special way how you define it, at least 3 character long. At most it should be, I believe, 24 or 26, and it should just have the lower letters and numbers. So if you put something else, it will blow back,
Yep.
right? So this is the kind of conditions that we have there. Then of course you define this type of storage you wanna declare the SKU and then the tagging. But here
Mhm.
it's all written. Let's see if you're starting from scratch how it will look like, right? So if you go and use the snippets, just type res and then if you type the storage like this, or
Mhm.
what it would do is basically set ready kind of snippet codes that will generate that minimum representation of the Azure storage for you. And I'm going to press on tab here. And
Okay.
as you see, it's pre-populated for us. So it
Mhm.
actually has a different API here. But what you need to do is just type another tab here, put the name, let's say, MVP. But of course, we need to make sure it's in the
Single
MVP
quotes.
TechBytes, right? Today's
Yeah.
and some numbers to make it unique. So it's a location. In our case, we have a region as
Mhm.
a parameter that holds the location information, and that's it. You have everything there. But in your case, of course, when you define the SKU, depending what type of storage account you want, you can also parameterize this part SKU. But if you are doing it for development, it probably makes sense to have locally redundant so you don't get charged if you forget to, clean up your resources. So this
Great.
is, you get the red line here. The reason is because we already defined the same resource, meaning Visual
Mhm.
Studio Code is actually helping us to prevent some issues, in the beginning, from the beginning. And just to make it kind of easy on us, we can just put the two there, right? So it's
Okay.
up and running. And
So,
this is
so
all
I have a
cool.
question
Yeah. hmm
related to this. Is this an extension or is built into Visual Studio for all these auto completion and stuff?
Right. This auto completion and everything is part of Visual Studio and extension that we call Bicep, Azure Bicep. You
Okay.
need to go to these extensions if you use the Azure Bicep before and type the Bicep, and then you would get this Azure Bicep extension. You want to
Okay.
make sure you install this one so that you can get those validations and these nice features and IntelliSense that you would expect from Visual Studio Code.
Mm. Great.
Right.
Great.
Okay. So once this installed, actually another thing that how you would know that you have it is if you go back and create any file with Bicep extension, you would see that icon also of
Okay.
robotic arm, which represents
Mm.
Azure Bicep. Yeah. All right. So we have it here, but that's not the main purpose, right? So let's see how it would look like. And let me actually let's have it here for now. So here, what we are going to do, we are just going to compile this into ARM template and see how it would look if you use the ARM template like you would have to do it a couple years ago. Before doing that, I'm going to use the Azure Bicep Visualizer here.
Okay.
Okay. And it will tell us, what are the resources that are going to be deployed. In my case, as you remember, let me take this out. we already created one storage account, and then we have this second one here. And the
Mhm.
next one, play website. This is something that I am actually going to demo a little bit later, where we'll use this feature called insert resource from your existing Azure Bicep
Okay.
environment. Mhm. So it's nicely visualized here. That's cool. But I think our purpose was here within like how many? 26 lines. We define two storage account and parameter, and there are some white spaces. If you want to see how it will look like on Azure ARM template, we'll just right click here and say, okay, build ARM template. So this is part of
Okay.
this extension, and it will go, run command and succeed it. So once this built, how you would know it's built is you would want to go to the same folder where you have this bicep code defined, which is
Mhm.
here. So you said new file with .json,
Okay.
extension has been created, and this is your ARM template representation here. I'm going to, take this out, and you would see that 20 we had like 24, 26 lines, but here
Mhm.
we'll actually take this out. So these two storage accounts that we defined with schema and everything, but represented as a JSON with our ARM template are much longer. It's like 40 lines of code or so, 44. So it's kind of
Okay.
very short and concise if you use the Azure Bicep, and it's easy to
Mhm.
understand, right? So here, if you look at parameterization, you would say there's a specific syntax that you would have to learn, right? And
Mhm.
it's basically not as intuitive as you would do with Azure Bicep. you know. So this is
Great.
the biggest advantage here. Azure Bicep is much cleaner syntax, easy to learn. Let me switch now back to we'll do some deployments, but before doing them, I wanna develop our Bicep knowledge and go, so that we can have much more, I would say, um,
Mhm.
we would have those deployment demos coming. So don't worry about that. Yeah.
Sounds good.
So we get from here. Sounds good. So far, so good.
Yeah.
So I hope that's what I convince you to use Azure Bicep in the future, or
I'm
not
sold.
yet.
Well, let's
All
see.
right.
Let's continue
Thanks,
on and
sir.
see what other magic you're gonna
Yeah,
pull.
all right then. Yeah, let's see what's coming next. Okay, next is actually, so if you solve for Azure Bicep, this is the resource I would recommend anyone to go and
Mhm.
start learning Azure Bicep. It's maintained by the community called Awesome Azure Bicep. You can find in GitHub. And what it has, it
Okay.
basically has a number of resources from official Microsoft Learn sources and from the community, including the
Mhm.
videos, podcasts, GitHub, articles, everything. So I would say go and look at that. And once you go to that repo and you want to, let's say, get started with Azure Bicep. So I'm in GitHub now.
Mhm.
So awesome Azure Bicep. Let me, yeah, it takes a little bit cycles. Awesome Azure Bicep is this repo, again, maintained by the community of,
Mhm.
I believe, 12 or 15 people now. And here, it describes basically everything that you need to have in place to get started. You just need to look at them and get started. But if you, for example, want to build your command line, how you want to interact with that, you have two options. Yeah, you can start with Azure CLI, and here are the links how you can install it on different platforms, right? It's a
Mhm.
cross-platform tool, by the way, Azure CLI. And if you are more of a PowerShell person, you can also do the same. And here is the links and everything how you can get started. This is also posted on
Great.
my blog, but it's easy way to start. But once you are done with that, you just go look what you are trying to accomplish and read through the blogs or watch the videos, and you are up to speed with that. So that said,
Excellent.
this is the Azure, this is about that. In terms of Azure Bicep evolution, it's actually start from
Mhm.
2020, right? It started from 2020, and currently we are at the latest version, which is 0.22. It's not stable version 1.0 yet, but there are a
Mhm.
bunch of things in that you can use. You don't have to wait for the stable version 1.0. Uh-huh.
I
Go
wanted to
ahead.
ask, like, how do you make sure that you're actually running the latest version of Bicep? Because, like,
Oh,
seems like alpha and all these other stuff.
that, that's a good question. So let's switch to the Visual Studio Code now, and let's
Sure.
fire up our terminal, which is hiding now. So let's go back. So let's make it big like this. So let's say, depending, you can run, on a Git bash, PowerShell, command line, whatever you want.
Mm,
It's all going to be the more or less same. So my computer's a little bit, yep, now it is here. So how you would know which version you are running. So the best thing to see that do you have that or not is basically just, I'm going to use that with Azure CLI now to show the example. So if you type
mm,
Azure Bicep, okay, and then version, yeah, here we go.
there you go.
So here we go. We see that this is the version latest because I don't have anything. But it's possible that you don't have the latest, right? Or you want to
Mm,
use the previous version. At that time, you
yeah,
can type AZ Bicep list versions. Okay, so we are moving ahead from here. We have this list. If, for example, you can also say Azure Bicep and you can install a new version. You can say install and help because you want to install a specific version of Azure Bicep where you know that your um, declaration and your code, everything is working. Then you can use
mm,
AZ Bicep install. I'm running the help command now. So here, why I put that there, because if you remember, we had previous versions here, right? And let's say in your
mm,
code, you installed this version 2004, and you want to make sure that you revert back to the same version. At that point, you can always come to this command tool and type az bicep, and then install
mm,
command, and then we define the version, and then you just copy paste that version that you're
mm.
sure that it was there, right? Then what we are
Okay.
going to do now is we are going to install that version.
So are they breaking changes
Yes.
between versions by any chance?
Not lately, but there are
Okay.
possibilities. Like in early stage, probably 8 months ago, when I was writing some Azure Bicep code, I realized that after you know uploading the latest version, my previous code is not working. There's some syntax errors or certain build didn't work. At that point,
Okay.
I reverted back by installing the prior version. Everything worked, and there was a bug that get fixed, in next week by the Azure Bicep
Okay.
team. So it's very possible that you'll hit that type of things. That's why I'm trying
Mm,
to show the way how you can roll it back to the version where you are sure that it was working yesterday.
great.
Yeah. So here, we reverted back to the previous version. I'm going to clean the screen here. And what I'm going to do now, I'm going to run the same command, easy bicep version. This time we should not get the latest, right? We should get the
Mm,
prior version that we set it up. And we'll also get a yellow warning here telling us, hey, you don't have the latest version. Do you want to upgrade your Azure Bicep? Here you go. So it get that yellow message saying you don't have the latest. And if we go and type AZ Bicep, upgrade,
mm.
it's going to
Upgrade to the latest version.
latest versions. Yep, it will update to that 0.22 version that we had prior. So
Mm,
that's how you do the version, management and controlling, just in case if the latest version broke your code, so to speak. And now what we are going to do is we are going to look at more depth. Before doing that, I want to go through some recent Azure Bicep releases. And where you can
mm,
get them, I mean, you can go to the GitHub Azure Bicep and look at them. Here we go. So this is the Azure Bicep main kind of GitHub repo
mm,
where all the issues and everything recorded. So if you go to the releases, these are the releases and notes about what is new, what was before, what were the bug fixes, as we mentioned, just a few seconds or minute ago, and all the things here. So, but the main purpose
mm,
here, why I'm showing that is to tell you that it's a language in development, but most of the core functionalities are already developed and it's ready for prime time. So don't get into thinking that you have to wait for stable version 1.0, but depending on your
mm.
organization policy, right, you would have to act accordingly. But this is the where it is.
Okay.
So anyway, in this new, Azure Bicep releases, I listed some of these updates that happened in last few months. They are the main ones.
Mm,
There was like this new deployment pane, which we are going to demo, and I will show you how you can enable that on your environment. And then there's like formatter, user-defined types. They are still getting developed and
okay.
refined. We'll look into Bicep Param files, what it is, and how to use that. And I hope you will like that when you compare that with ARM JSON parameters that you would have to use before this. It was not intuitive,
Mm.
so to speak. And you also have Azure Container Registry, updates in terms of help on the text. And when you want to version control your Azure modules for your company in a way that you can access and control the access to your modules, you can use Azure Container Registry. So let's jump into the demo here, okay,
Okay.
and look at these parameters, right? Because we talked a lot about parameters here and we want to have a reusable code. So if you go to the Visual Studio Code, so we are going to navigate to the folder called
Mm.
param files, which stands for parameter files. And here you would see that I have a param files main bicep file, this guy over here. So what it is basically a familiar thing that we developed just a few minutes ago. It defines
Yeah.
a storage account location, which is the Azure region where you want to deploy it as a parameter. Then we define on a second line here, we define the storage account name, how we want it to be
Mm.
called. But we don't have any validation here, right? So it would be nice to build validations, which we'll do just in a few minutes. And then we just have a boilerplate information where we define the storage account and we assign the parameters and the kind of the storage. So it's
Okay.
here, it's ready, but we want to use that differently. We want to use this file with uh, uh, but you may say, what we want to use differently here. So we want to do the following. We want to deploy this file into our existing Azure environment. You would have to log
Mm.
into there. And you would see that when you do this, you would have to type parameters manually because, we
Okay.
didn't define anything, right? So to do that, actually within the same folder, you would find that I created a script file for you if you never did that to save some time. It's called MVP-TechBytes-demo easy CLI. And if you never
Okay.
log in and authenticate yourself with Azure Bicep, you would want to go and run this command first and follow this, which will ask you for your password, login, and then MFA authentication or whatever you have on your phone, which is
Mm.
highly recommended. And then, it will, if you want, once you went through that authentication, which I'm not going to do today, you just run the, AZ account show query name. And what it would do is basically it will grab the Azure subscription name for you and show it that, hey, this is the Azure subscription name where you currently authenticated. In my case, it's
Mm.
called MVP subscription 07. That's where we are.
Okay.
Let me actually make it a little bit bigger here. And then, just to make sure that we are in the right subscription, you can always go and type a command here, which is going to list all the resource group that you have under this subscription. In my case, I should have around like 10 resource groups in this subscription, which I'm having in place. So it's going to list the subscription now, and we have the names, and everything. So just to be sure that you are also aware about that. All right. So here in
Mm.
subscriptions, we have, okay, I'm going to navigate to the resource groups. Yep. And then we are going to select the subscription that we are currently authenticated. And these are the basically 10 resource group that I was talking about. Now, what we are going
Okay.
to do, we are going to create a new resource group and we'll deploy our, storage account there, right? To do that, we are going to create the resource group first. And to do that, you can use the code that's on the line number 9. I'm not going to type it manually because
Okay.
sometimes when you type things manually, you can, make the mistakes. So to avoid that, I'm just going to run those scripts and you can reuse those scripts for your own purposes. So what it's going to do is currently we are going to create a resource group in East
Mm.
US. This is the location. And
Okay.
the name of the resource group that we want to have is called resource group MVP TechBytes demo, right? So it's kind of related. And we get the
Yeah.
success message here. So let's
Great.
go to, we can go ahead and check that on your Azure Bicep on your Azure environment, right? Subscription. So if you
So
go back to
can you
subscription
actually
here,
make
yes,
can you actually make Bicep to actually create the resource group for you?
that's a great question. Yes, you can.
Hmm.
And to do that, I have a demo, but if you want, you can jump into that demo. So for example, this sample that I have, it deploys, deploys a resource group, and then it deploys the storage with a lock so that nobody can delete that storage
Okay.
accidentally.
Hmm.
And to do that, this is the demo it's 3 dash deploy storage with log bicep file. If I visualize that, just to give you idea, how good is a visualizer here, it will tell you, okay, if you take this code on the left and deploy, it will do the following. It will create a storage module as a
Hmm.
resource group, and then
Hmm.
it will create a my resource group where it belongs to, and then it will create a storage account that has a lock resource attached to that, meaning that you cannot accidentally go and delete your storage account.
Great.
But yes, to come back to your question, Taswar, if you want to create a resource group, you need to define that as it is defined
Hmm.
here. But another
Okay.
thing that you would have to do is you need to define a correct target scope, which
Okay.
has to
The
be your
subscription
subscription.
of it, basically. Yeah.
Yes. In our case, in the previous demo here, if you see, I didn't define any target scope because by default, it's
Hmm.
going to pick up the resource group, and you would have to provide resource group for your bicep file so it deploys everything in that resource group. If you want to create a resource group like the one here, you would have to target your deployment into subscription level, subscription target.
Exactly.
That should be your
Hmm.
scope. But if you want to create, for example, subscriptions or management groups, then you need to target more of a tenant or management group level. In our
Yeah.
case, by default, yeah, it's going to be all to the resource group. Yeah. So I'm going to go back to the Visual Studio Code here,
Sure.
uh, to our, you know, let me minimum
Storage.
storage. Yeah, I think we don't need this one for now. We were here at the subscription. So the one
Hmm.
that we were looking into, let me go back to that demo, was the demo where we want to show the parameters, right? So this was where we
Yeah.
are. Let me actually show it on the screen again, right? So we want to look at the parameters. So to look at those parameters, I will go back to the main bicep, which is under the modules here,
Hmm.
right? So main bicep file, and we say that if we go and want to deploy that, you would have to do everything manually, right? You would have to
Yeah.
write down the parameters manually during the process and everything. And in addition to that, I just mentioned that you would have to go and create the resource group that we just created here. The
Hmm.
resource group MVP Tech Demo Bytes, and then once it is there, and you see that in your Azure subscription, you would have to go and deploy the template, right? So what we are going to do is we are going to go ahead and deploy our template file without any
Hmm.
parameter, like here.
Okay.
Okay. So we just need to type AZ deployment group create, define our resource group, then put the uh, file path to our parameter file, which is
Hmm.
under the param files by main bicep, the one that we just saw here,
Yeah.
which requires two parameters. So once we say dash C here, if we put the dash C, we want to make sure that when we deploy that, it's going to succeed and what's going to be created, right? So we don't want to just blindly deploy that. Then we say dash C, which is a conditional deployment that it
Okay.
stands for. It's going to go ahead and check the resource group and environment where we are trying to deploy this new storage account. And it
Hmm.
will tell us that is it going to create a new storage account with the name that we define, or it's going to, uh, update the existing one if there's already one
Hmm.
in that environment. So we got back, a question, right? If you remember, we defined two parameters, but we had no
Hmm.
default values. So it's asking us
Yeah.
for the location name, this time, if you want, you can put the west US as well. I mean, it doesn't
Yeah.
need to be east US always, but
Mm.
because we put the east US in the beginning for our resource group, it makes sense to use the same.
Yeah.
Uh, then east US, and then name of the storage account. We can say MVP TechBytes STG stands for storage account, and
Mm.
then put some random numbers to make sure it's a unique storage account name, and then just press enter. Actually, when we put these parameters, it's not going to deploy that storage account into subscription. What it is
Mm.
doing now is, because we put the dash C, which is conditional deployment, it
Yeah.
will check the environment where we are trying to deploy and will tell us, is it okay or not to deploy,
Okay.
and what would happen. So in our case, we get this green, response back, which means that it says, okay, we are going to create this new storage account and you are good to go. Do you want to proceed with that parameters? Yes or no? In our
Okay.
case, we would say, okay, go ahead and deploy. And once we say yes, only at that point, our resource is going to be deployed into this new resource group that we just created.
Okay.
Now it's actually happening. It will ask again, it will run us through the same loop. It will ask for the same parameters because the first one we didn't deploy. I will type the same thing here, STG and 67, and press enter. Now actual deployment will kick in. And while this
Okay.
deployment is kicked in, it says running here. We are going to switch to the Azure portal and see what's happening there.
Okay.
Here. So what we are going to do here, I will zoom into the resource group that we just created. If you remember, this was the resource
Mm.
group that we created. And then if we go inside this resource group, we see that there are some files already deployed there. But the
Mm.
one that we just deployed, if you go to deployment tab here on the resource group, we said that was that main file. That's how it is called.
Mm.
This is just get deployed 23 seconds ago. And if you look at that in overview, this is the resource group. This is the storage account that we
Mm.
just pushed into our new resource group that we have in place. All right. So this
Cool.
is we succeeded, but it was a lot of steps, right? We have to
Mm.
kind of go type the parameters and everything. So it's a lot of headaches, so to speak. So how we can automate that is, one way to do that is to use the parameter files, right? And to use the parameter files, you can come to the same file and you can use some built-in features that will help you. You can right click on that Bicep file where you want to create parameters and come and say build. Uh, Let me go up here. We have this under the build arm template, we have generate parameter file. So we
Mm.
are going to click on that. And here on top, you see we have an option to create this as a JSON or Bicep Param.
Okay.
And if you just click, for example, one of them, let's say JSON, and then say there are required parameters and there are all. And the difference
Mm.
is required parameters are the ones that where you didn't define any default values. So it's going to be, have to be implemented. And all
Okay.
means it's all. It will just, implement all. So in any cases, putting the all kind of makes sense. So once you click on that, what happens is that you would see that you would get for the same main bicep file that we have here, you would get this main parameters.json created.
Okay.
And what it is basically for this given template, it will create parameter file which is defined as a JSON description. So you have location here and we have storage account name, right? So it's
Okay.
both are here. If you go and do the same thing with the bicep parameters, you would get a file created here, main.bicep param, and
Okay.
it's of course going to be empty. In our case, I pre-created that, and it will have some empty values like this.
Okay.
It's going to be empty in the beginning, but then if you want
Mm.
to set up the values, you can of course set them up. So in my case, what I did, I went and created actually I added these default values, VSCode 3 as a resource
Mm,
group region, as a region location where I want to deploy, and storage account name. Uh, and then I have parameter JSON, which I didn't use here. So for this file, if you want to deploy this storage account and any other resources that are there with parameters, so we don't have to type anything in the process, and you can define, of course, the environment. Like I put dev here, you can
mm,
have staging, test, production, depending on where you are deploying and the permissions you want to have in place. uh, so if you want to deploy this, what you do is basically, again, I have this small um, way to define it. You would do the same thing. You will run the same command that we ran previously. If you remember, this was
mm,
the command that we run.
yeah,
But in addition to
mm,
that, you would have to define a parameter file, right? So we'll have these
okay,
parameters at the end, and then define the location of parameter from where we want to deploy it. So if you go and run that, you can of course use the conditional deployment, but because you know how it works, I'm not,
sure.
I'm not going to use that now because it takes some time. But if you right click and go ahead and deploy that template in installation with the parameters, now what will happen within a deployment group name that's called MVP TechBytes demo, it's going to deploy our storage account with all
Mm,
the parameter values that we have. So location of our deployment of the storage account is going to be the West US, and it would use this storage account name that we define in our parameter.
okay. So
Mhm.
basically, you're just providing an extra parameter for telling the command line, here's the parameters that are filled
Yes.
up in this file. Basically, you can look at it.
Correct. Yes. And it will go and, once this succeeds, when you go and look at your Azure environment using the same resource group that we defined there, which is resource group name
Okay. So,
MVP-tech bytes demo, we should see a new, yeah, deployment.
so the question is basically, is there a convention sort of thing? Like without you providing the parameter file, it would
hmm
automatically know that, "Hey, you know what, this is a parameter file. I'll pick it up." It doesn't do that, right? You have to provide
So
in the command line.
yes, you have to. If you don't define parameter file, what will happen is that it will look, Bicep will look inside your template, Bicep code
Mm,
template, and identify parameters that don't have a assigned value, and then it will ask you before executing your code, before executing and deploying your resource to the environment.
okay.
Whatever is missing,
Okay.
in our case, values for your parameters, it will ask for it. So there's no
Okay.
convention to pick it up automatically.
Okay.
Okay, so once we have this in place, of course, you can switch back to your resource group here, refresh that, and we should get this MVP Tech Bytes, this new
Mm,
storage group created for us. And if you look at overview, you would see that it's West US3, so it's
yeah.
in a different location than your
Great.
resource group. So we succeeded in deploying that it here. All right.
Mm,
So we deployed that, using the parameter file, but I would
mm,
say that you can do the same operation. Okay, same operation uh, by using not the bicep param like it is here, the one that we use. You can
mm.
also assign the values to your JSON parameterization file. It will do the same. You
Okay.
just put the
Mm,
parameter file pass, and it will pick up and make it work. All right. So
great.
that's it. I'm going to switch back here to our presentation. Uh, so there are more features and more demos that I would like to show. And this time, we are going to look at another demo where we want to have more real world kind of scenario, right? Where you have some validation in place, you have some guardrails to make sure that whoever enters parameters, and if there is something wrong in that, you can catch early in the game, so you
Okay.
don't deploy something that's wrong, you know that it's going to fail, right? So
Mm-hmm.
to make that happen, we are going to navigate here to Visual Studio Code, and we will look at another demo that's going to use under the param files again. It's a little bit messy here. I create new files, but um, you can look at this example where we define a bicep code called web app dash services with parameter hardening. And let's put this down here. So here what we have, this is the example of Bicep file where we have some validation and hardening in place. And what it
Mm-hmm.
helps is it will help you to specify specific regions only that your organization wants to deploy the resources. In our case, this is the list of resources that I have in place here. These are the region names. And then you want to define, that for applications web app services, minimum you have to have two characters at least, in the name, and max is 60. So you define another validation on top of that to make sure wrong or invalid app service name doesn't get entered as a parameter.
Mm-hmm.
Then you also define application service plan name, and then environments, right? So if you have like three environments, in my case, I choose the obvious like dev test prod. You can define environments as well. So somebody who is trying to deploy this file, if they type an environment name development xzy, it's not going to
Mm-hmm.
work because you don't have such an environment, right? So you want a controlled list, and then you define a configuration map. So what it is, it's basically for certain environments, let's say for the dev environment, you want to make sure that you pick up the SKU of your app service, which is going to be using this free SKU. Then for the test environment, you are going to use the shared SKU of the application service, web app
Mm-hmm.
that you have in Azure. And then for the prod, you have, a different SKU. So
Okay.
what it helps is it's kind of centralized way to manage all your configurations. It may work for certain organization, but may not work for different, because in some places, for example, for production, you want to have a separate file, parameter
Mm-hmm.
file, where you define them, and only selected list of people should have access there, right? Because it's more sensitive and you don't want to expose that. So this is
Mm-hmm.
just for small organizations where um, this is just one way to do that, but it is not the, of course, the ultimate way to doing this.
Mm-hmm.
This is easiest way, so to speak, to start. And then, of course, once you define this parameter config map, this is the name that used for it, then you define
Mm-hmm.
your variable, right, where you pick up those configurations from your config map that we just went through. It's for instance name and instance tier, and then you basically use them when you define your resources. Here we define the application service plan, which is also called
Mm-hmm.
server farm. That's the provider name and resource type for it. As you see, it's all parameterized here. We don't have any hard-coded naming. And then for your app service itself, you define again the naming, parameterization, location, everything is parameterized. And at the end, you want to have some output, meaning you want to know what would be the endpoint of your deployment of web app
Mm-hmm.
that you can access. So this is all good, but if this code is new to you, it would be hard to figure out what's going on, right? And if you are reading this code, one of the again uh, best tools that Azure Bicep provides is the Bicep Visualizer. You can go
Mm-hmm.
here, and this code is going to visualize to you the relationship and resources that are going to be deployed if you are using this parameter file, this
Great.
Bicep code file, which is great
Mm-hmm.
way of looking into that. And again, this is I would say more parameterized and more hardened way of deploying and defining your Azure resource for deployment. So you can go
Oh.
and use the same way to deploy that. It's going to succeed, but this is one of the ways to do that. So once you have that in place, next thing that we want to look into, and we'll look at some more demos, is that uh, upcoming Bicep releases, right? So what to expect in the new, what are the new features that are going to come up to this Bicep language? And this is some list of them in terms of, there are still development going on Bicep Param to make it, even more robust. There's a Microsoft Graph uh, provider for the Bicep that's getting developed, and we'll look at that shortly. There's a request to pass the resources between the
Mm,
modules when you want to modularize your code, and there's a private registry completion request. So if you and we are going to on our next demo focus more on deployment pane and how to use that. But before
okay.
jumping into that, let's look at this enabling the graphic API to be used with Bicep. And this is something in development. It's not ready for prime time to show now, but this will enable you to create your Bicep code, right, which is going to interact with arm template, and it will have this extensibility provider that it can talk to Microsoft Graph API, which will bring information from Microsoft Entra, right, which is
Okay.
Azure AD, right,
Mm,
Microsoft Entra, and then help you to look at that information and use them in your deployment of resources. Okay,
okay.
that's kind of like biggest thing that's going on there. But next thing is experimental things that you can add into your Azure Bicep. And what it is, it's basically you need to enable that by going to the settings in your Visual Studio Code.
Mm,
Under the Bicep settings, you would need to make sure it's actually checked in. To show you in action, if I go to the Visual Studio Code, here under the file, you need to go to the preferences and then go to the settings.
mm,
And there are a number of settings here, but if you type Bicep here, by default, of course, it's going to be looking like this.
yeah.
You can use the search, and type Bicep. And within the Bicep, you would see that there is this experimental features that you can enable or
Okay.
disable. So this is all on you, that how you want to control that. In my case, I enabled the deploy pane, and what it is, you will just show in the demo. But before jumping to this demo, I just want to make sure that if you feel that some of these are not working well or you are getting some errors, you can always come to this settings and uncheck this to make sure that you don't the things that have been working before are working fine, because this is again experimental. Sometimes it may interfere with the code and functionality you would expect that has been
Okay.
working before, but for some reason
Yeah.
there's some bug. Okay, so we enabled that pane, right? And the next thing that we are going to look is another demo where it's going to come from a different place. So here under the modules, no, let me see. It's actually under this modules. You would say there's a samples folder, and we'll go to the 10-deploy file. So
Okay.
this file, if you look at that, it's targeting the subscription scope, right? It has some parameters here. Um, and then what we have here, we define the parameters and some description, but the idea here is that we want to deploy it in a different way, which is more graphical, where we define the
Mm,
parameters, we can enter them. To do that, we need to right click on the file, and then we navigate to the place we can see that it says show deployment pane. You can always
okay.
say show deployment pane to the slide, to the side, and
Mm,
it will appear like this. And what it is a really neat feature where you can interact visually with your file. So before before using this feature, let me actually close it, and let's look what we should expect from this deployment. And you would see that part of this deployment is going to deploy the resource group, the ones that you mentioned before.
mm,
And it's not just one resource group, right? So it deploys two different resource group, one for application, one for the storage. And then it in the application resource group, it defines the application resources, and for the storage account, it defines the storage with a lock. Okay,
okay.
and to do that, we are not going to use the command line this time. If you want to do the same thing from command line, again, you can use Azure CLI file that I provided here. You can do it from here, but in our case, we want to use this new feature, uh, the this the new feature that brings us the deployment pane. So we have let's use this deployment pane without, you can use it with parameters or by just typing. And to
Okay.
do that, first you would go and change the scope where you want to deploy that. In your case, you can choose from the subscriptions that you have.
Mm,
Let's say, I'm going to use this subscription, and then it will ask you for the which um, region you would like to deploy. In your
mm,
case, you just type the one that's closest to you. I will, for the private different, I will just choose the West US3 for now. And then you have a way to pick up a parameter. And this is actually a fix from a bug that we had on a previous version. It was
okay.
saying just pick up parameter. And when you click on that, it was looking for a JSON parameter. In my
Mm,
case, I have one, but it was not saying pick up a JSON parameter. So if you had a bicep param and you were trying to pick up a parameter, it would just be empty.
okay.
So they rename it to make sure that that's kind of one of the improvements, so to speak. But anyway, if you choose existing parameter that you already created, you
Mm,
can say select parameter, and what it would do, it will just rely on that parameter to make this deployment. And in
okay.
our case, if you look at that parameter to be sure what we are deploying, I will go to the parameter file here, and let me actually uh, make it bigger. So in our deployment, we define two resource groups names, right? We
Mm,
have this MVP TechBytes app demo, and we have this storage dash demo 1007. So these are the new two resource group names that we define. But then if you look at our deployment file itself, let me switch it here. You will see that deployment file itself will auto it's actually asked for the application resource group name, uh, storage resource group name, deployment region that's defined, and then
mm,
the generation of the storage module and the name of it. It's actually done using this string interpolation, meaning that I'm using some type of dynamic way to define the name of the storage account based on the storage resource group, based on the resource group actual ID, which is unique for that place. So each
great.
time when you use the same resource group name and same resource group resource, it will be the same ID, right? So and then of course you define the application group, and then you use the module here. It's, as you see, it's like very compact code, but it's actually relying
Mm,
on this app services module, which you can click on it and navigate there to see what it is. It's basically defines the application's service plan and web app, and then just deploys
mm,
it with an output parameter of the host name. Okay, I'm
okay.
going to go back to the main file here, and let's the show begin, right? So let's go here and deploy. But before deploying, it makes sense to run some validations and see
Sure.
would our deployment exceed or succeed or not. So you can click on
Okay.
validate. It will tell you, you see, so it says invalid deployment location West US3. I'm getting this. If you remember, we talked about ARM template, right?
Yeah.
And ARM layer. So on ARM layer, I put a Azure policy restriction saying that only allow deployment to East US, East US2, West US,
Mm,
and West US2. And this is the reason why I tell me, hey, you have some issue here. This
okay.
location, is not going to be, it's not going to happen. So
Mm,
that's kind of one way how your organization can control, who can deploy where and what regions can be used. I'm
mm,
not going to dive into that today, but that's the reason why you see it. So that's
okay.
why I want to edit my parameter, right? Because it's not going to happen. So to do
Mm,
that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to close this, go to my parameters, and in my parameter file say, okay, wait, yeah, this is EastUS2. So my parameter file is correct, but the one that I
yeah.
choose while deploying was WestUS3. That's why it was a reason. So I'm going
Mm,
to go back to my deployment file code, right click and say again, go back to the show deployment pane on the side. This time we are going to change the scope to make sure we choose a, and this time I'm going to choose the location that is to S2 and see what happens this time.
Okay.
And now we are going to validate again. Now it's succeeded. So it means that
Mhm.
my organization actually doesn't allow me to, use those previous regions because I have policy in place. Okay,
Okay.
so once this succeeded, we can say what if. So if you remember, what if is a way to make sure that before you actually deploy your resources, in our case, it's a two resource groups and resources inside that, it will check and say that, okay, if you deploy it as is it going to succeed or not? And if it
Okay.
succeeds, what will happen? So in our case, if I make it bigger, you'll see, let's say, okay, these are the resources that you are going to deploy, and this
Mhm.
is all going to be created, meaning that we don't have those resources now, we are going to create new resources. And I say, yeah, that looks correct, let's kick the deploy. So now if you have a cup of coffee, you can go take it, sip it, and then in couple seconds, at most in a minute or so, we'll be back and you would see that uh, what the, what is the operation status. Are we going to
Right.
succeed or we will
Right.
get the failure? Going back to the slides while deployment going, I would just say that if you remember, we mentioned the visualizer. So this is
Mhm.
how visualizer looked like, a couple months ago when there was no update and there was no visualization of the uh, icons for the resources, which is,
Okay.
and now
Yep.
after that update, visualizer 2.0 has much beautiful kind of representation of the resource that
Mhm.
you are going to deploy. This is one of the good, I would say, updates that happen there. And next is actually we are going to wrap up. Before showing the result of what happens in our deployment, what we did, we went through some express intro into Azure Bicep. I hope you are now feel more confident with Azure Bicep. We looked at the
Mhm.
latest on Azure Bicep, some releases, what's upcoming, what's already there, how we can use the experimental features like the one that we just had with the deployment panes. And then we
Mhm.
looked a number of demos kind of to get hands-on experience on what it looks like learning and doing Azure resource development in Bicep.
Okay.
That said, let's look at our Visual Studio Code and say succeeded, right? So we
Great.
succeeded in our
Mhm.
deployment. These are the resources that get deployed. If you look into, if you go to the our subscription and look at the resource groups, let's go to the subscription. Actually, I should go to the resource groups and then let's select the subscription. Here we go. As you see, it says there's 12, and this is the we have you know deployed
Mhm.
to resource group. One is for the storage and another one is for the app. So if you look at the app, sorry, we would see that this deployed two resources here, and in the deployments pane uh, settings, you would see that this is the success. And if you go to the storage, you should see that there's a storage account that's get
Mhm.
deployed. And if you remember, we were talking about lock, right? So if you look at the
Yeah.
logs, you see that this lock is protecting from deletion of that storage account. And what I mean by that is if you go back to the storage account and click on it and say, you know what, I want to delete that, but you shouldn't be deleting. Uh,
Mhm.
and go here and say, let it bring, hey, I want to delete this. It will actually tell you that, hey, there's actually a lock you
Mhm.
cannot delete. So you can't just click on it. And even if you try from the Azure CLI, you will get error because there's a lock
Mhm.
that protects your storage account from getting deletion. Anyway,
Great.
that was kind of deployment of those two resource group into our Azure subscription. We looked into different things and we looked into how it gets succeeded. So
Mhm.
that said, if you have any questions about that while you are watching this on YouTube or any other channel, please feel free to put the questions there. We will check that back and make sure that you get them answered.
Great.
And in terms of we'll get check them and answered. So any questions on your end, Taswar, that you may
Yeah,
have?
I wanted to ask, what are the good references to start learning about Azure Bicep? I know you mentioned
That's
the GitHub, but like, what are the other
yeah.
things? There must be lots.
Yeah, that's actually a really good question because we need to continue learning Azure Bicep, right? Because this is so cool. And to do that, I created these QCR codes and we'll put the links in the description of this video where you can, on the left, the one that you see here, it's a Learn Bicep GitHub that we used during this demo. Then
Mm-hmm.
you have this Bicep project from GitHub, the official project that has all these latest releases that you should expect to see. And then you have actually two video courses here, Azure Bicep First Look and Building Infrastructure as a Code Part 1.
Mm-hmm.
It's on the LinkedIn platform. So if you have subscription or you are eager to learn by watching, I would strongly recommend to go and look at them. And of course, if you want to contribute into the Azure Bicep learning community by sharing what help you and what you create to help others, you can
Mm-hmm.
always come and contribute to this awesome Azure Bicep GitHub repo that has a number of official and community created resources. But that's not all. There are more. In addition to that, these are the kind of screenshots from that LinkedIn videos that we just
Mm-hmm.
spoke about. And
Yeah.
here's a spoiler. In a month, you would get the building infrastructure as a code with Bicep Part 2 video, which will be continuation of this part one, which is going to focus more on some advanced topics if you want to create the Azure Bicep. But let's say you are not a video person, right? Then you want a book, you want to read from book and understand the old school way. That's
Yeah.
another option, right? Some people, and sometimes myself as well, I just want to grab a book and look what's going on, and have some type of guidance from the book. This is the book that Kasun, my MVP friend, and myself, we
Mm-hmm.
started to write this for the pact, and it's in progress. It's going to come probably by the end of year, beginning of the
Great.
2024. And
Mm-hmm.
stay tuned up, on social media. I will try to make sure that you get the link and get updates about the progress that we are making on this book for all the readers and all the audience that are interested in infrastructure, management with Azure
Mm-hmm.
Bicep.
Great. Thank you
Yeah,
so much, Ilkan. Like, I mean, this was amazing. You have a videos, two extra videos, and a book. We'll put them all in the show notes when the books comes out too. And thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I learned so much about bicep today. I feel stronger.
wow. So we build our bicep skills, but I want to say thank you back to you, Taswar, for
Mhm.
organizing this and sending the invite to participate in MVP Tech Bytes. This is very awesome to interact with the community and give back with the knowledge and advancement that we see in Microsoft Azure. That's how you can
Mhm.
much better and cleaner manage your Azure resources by helping your customers and yourself in this journey.
Great. Thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much. Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.